Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Now, today I'm in the hot seat. Tim Patton and I are beginning a series somewhat analogous to my series with Keith Preston on pain anarchism, and the one I did begin with the Identity Dixie crowd on Southern kinism. My concept of New Zion. I've sort of mentioned in offhand remarks here and there, but never really talked about it. And Tim has been indefatigable in asking me questions about it. So I thought, well, why don't we put it to good use? So we'll hand it over to you, Tim.
Well, my first question is, what is New Zion, and when did you develop the idea of this? We're going to talk about historical precedents in a bit, but just sort of sketch out a thumbnail version of what is New Zion.
Okay, so looking at, real quick, can you mute yourself when you're not talking?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So the first thing is, when it comes to New Zion, the point is this. I was looking at in the late Obama, early Trump years, we see the rise of the alt-right, right? With the early Bush years, we saw the libertarian insurgency. And all of these, what you might say, ideologies outside the Overton window have an explanation for, I mean, they obviously reject the status quo, but they give an interpretation of why the West was successful. So libertarians, if you had to boil it down to a single concept, it's private property. The West was that part of the world in which a private property system was established. Okay. Then the next one is the alt-right. The alt-right argues that success was racial homogeneity and in-group preference amongst white people, which was sometimes, but not always, associated with high IQ. And then I guess you could say another element is, this isn't so much a popular element on YouTube, though I guess it's becoming more of one, is the Christian apologetics scene, where the argument goes something like, the modern West as we know it for the past 1700 years was essentially Christian of some kind. And one of the reasons why the West is such a sorry state is because we've rejected Christianity in favor of atheism, humanism, liberalism, fill in the blank ism. So looking at that, I'm like, well, okay, all of these on one hand have a certain plausibility if you look at facts a certain way and just leave out other things. But if you if you look at all the different factors, which I've already essentially done in other places in my criticism of the alt-right and libertarians, they don't capture everything. And so the question I asked myself is, when the West was healthy, strong, and vibrant, what were the conditions that were in place? And more specifically, healthy, strong, and vibrant in the modern age. Now, all of these people would look to, say, 19th century Europe and say that it was rich, prosperous, healthy. Everything on paper looks like it was going really well. So I thought, well, what were the conditions that were present at the time? Okay, well, I agree. We need private property. I agree we need a high trust society. And I agree we need Christianity. But if we look at what I've identified then is the four factors that I think are responsible for the West's rise to power in the last 500 years since Martin Luther. There is the highest concentration of capital, the greatest level of technological development, the greatest level of literary achievement have been achieved in what I would call one criteria is Northwest Europeans. So Europeans living around the North Sea, or transplants. So Canada, United States, South Africa, and Australia are all transplants of Dutch and English who live around the North Sea. And by extension, the Baltic. So Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and then they're transplants. Okay, that's one aspect, Northwest Europeans. Second aspect, Protestant religion. England, Holland. Holland, in the 17th century was a population of 2 million people that had the world's largest economy and was the forebear of the world of global markets. They developed banking and shipping techniques. England continued that trend. And then the United States, I guess you could argue, perfected it. But even on the continent, like with Germany and Sweden, pursuing a less maritime avenue for a more army-based system, monarchy system, rather than naval republics, again, were extremely successful. I mean, Frederick the Great single-handedly held off all the powers of Europe in the 7 Years' War, with England as a distant ally, and the two world wars that took a global coalition to crush Germany. So yeah, it lost, but what other nation could have survived such pressures? So, okay, these are all Protestant countries. Latin America, Russia, Southern Europe, Catholic Orthodox countries typically have lagged behind and or been conquered by Muslims or revolutionaries. So, again, not so much. The third criteria is largely free markets. So, England, United States, Holland, they were not completely laissez-faire, like, say, some sort of libertopia, but they respected markets, property rights, contracts, things of that nature. And then fourthly, consensual government, whether it's a constitutional monarchy or a republic, as in the case of Holland, the United States, and South Africa, was the form of government that was in place. The more autocratic a government is, the less innovation and liberty you tend to see. Now, it's not enough to say that I want a revitalized West. What kind of a West do I want? Because we have all this disagreement. Do you want, neo-pagan Odinism? Do you want the Catholic Holy Roman Empire? Do you want the Russian Orthodox Empire? Do you want, some sort of high Toryism? Again, there's disagreement there. And to put, not too fine a point on it, something like what we saw in Anglo-Saxon England prior to 1066, or colonial America prior to 1776, with, understandable variations within that. So to make a long story short, that's how I started to the idea of New Zion. Now, New Zion is really an attempt to theoretically create or a sort of unified sociological political system that acknowledges those four factors and seeks to create what we might call virtuous circles or positive feedback loops that would allow a society to replicate those systems into the future. So as an example, when the founding fathers wanted to build a new republic, after essentially a millennium and a half hiatus for republican governments, they looked at the Greeks and the Romans, they looked at the Italian city-states, and they said, well, what worked and what didn't? And let's learn from that to make a better republic. New Zion is to be conceived in that vein of political thought or experimentation. So that would be the answer to your first question.
All right, so that's the answer to me first. This question is going to have two parts. So the first part is, what are its historical precedents, or current precedents? For example, you have the Calvinists in Geneva, set up a sort of private, dictatorship almost there. You have the Anabaptist communities in the Dutch, which were, of course, transplanted over here. You have the Anglican Church, which is sort of stuck somewhere in between. You also have various Protestant breakaway groups all throughout the German province as well. Are any of these things historical precedents? That's first. And the second part is the society you're thinking of. Also, you can include Puritans in North America, all the original founding colonies of the United States as well. But the second question, is the society you want a kind of flash in the pan that had certain factors that are only available between 1500 and 1800 that cannot be replicated currently or in the future? Is the kind of society that you talked about a sort of remnant between when we had an agricultural society, increasing population, lots of land available to be settled throughout Australia, New Zealand, United States, South Africa, and so forth. Not many places left to do that currently. So those are my two first questions, a two-parter.
Sure. So let's answer the first question. When we speak of terms of historical antecedents, I think it's helpful to look at antecedents, firstly, of the four criteria, and then secondly, of any sort of amalgamation of all four. So let's begin with the first one, Northwest Europeans. Prior to the Christian era, Northwest Europeans, Britons, Germanic tribes, were not very sophisticated. They might have been sophisticated warriors. Saxons, Goths, Vikings terrorized people for over a millennium. So as far as power projection and defense, that's not really a question. And also, if I had to pick the best elements of these cultures prior to the Christian era, it would be their tremendous spirit of freedom and liberty. So in the 19th century, Romanticism with England and America, the Teutonic tribes, for example, led by Arminius and defeated the Romans at the Teutoburg Forest, were widely regarded as progenitors of the Anglo project, the Anglo-Saxon project. And Arminius was, of course, killed for trying to become a king. The sort of phobia of kingship was present in these primordial German peoples. The oldest assembly in continual use in Europe is the Icelandic Althing. And the Icelandic Althing developed in the early 10th century with displaced Norwegians fleeing the tyranny of the consolidation of the Norwegian kingdom. I think it was King Olaf. And frankly, it's almost like the United States. I mean, you just had a lot of free land. People could just settle there and kind of vote on their own things. Ultimately, that did collapse. It lasted about 200 years. And it was kind of a refuge for people in Scandinavia fleeing the consolidation of the kingdoms, which was marked by bloodshed, war, and tyranny. So from the purely Northwest European perspective, prior to the infusion of Christianity and Greco-Roman classical values, we do have a strong, robust tradition of liberty, sort of quasi-democratic institutions. The Germanic tribes and the Northmen, their warband leaders were elected based on their ability to have performance, whereas Roman generals in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries were appointed based on who they knew or who they were friends with. So naturally enough, they were losing to the Germans because the Germans were at the cutting edge, always promoting the best. And we see this same trend with the Viking era, where with the exception of Alfred the Great, no single Western European leader is able to stand up to the Vikings. And that's because, again, they're always selecting for the best leadership. So in that regard, the sort of political institutions of representative government and in-group ethnic homogeneity are already in existence prior to the Christian era in these Northwest Europeans. Now, when it comes to these kinds of government, we also see it in Greece and in the Roman Republic, though they are of a somewhat different ethnic background than what I'm imagining here. We do see precedents with Athens and Corinth and the Roman Republic itself, and the Italian city-states of the Middle Ages like Venice and Genoa. Now, we look at, I sort of amalgamated 2 points into one: ethnic in-group preference and representative government. Now, in the case of Venice, Genoa, the Italian city-states, and the Roman Republic, this sort of is preempting your second question, which I'll get to in more detail later, is these were not primarily land-based representative governments. Well, the late Roman Republic wasn't anyhow. It was based on mercantile exchange, as was the Dutch. So the Dutch, the Athenians, the Venetians, the late Roman Republic were not necessarily dependent upon widespread land ownership, though there were those that were, like the American Republic, Iceland, and the early Roman Republic. So the point being is I don't think it's as material mode of production dependent as one might think. Now, within the Christian era, we have, even before the rise of Protestantism, the Swiss cantons, Venice, Genoa, the city-states of the Baltic states and Lubeck, even in Russia with the Republican, the merchant princes of Novgorod and Pskov, and to an even larger extent Kiev and Vladimir and other places. Most of them were destroyed by the Mongols and then finally finished off by the Muscovites. Then you get to the Protestant Reformation, you get these Swiss cantons again, the Dutch Republic, certain independent religious groups, proto-Protestants like the Hussites, the Waldensians, and then Reformation groups like the Anabaptists, the Protestants in Geneva and Switzerland, and in Holland, and later the United States and Britain. Now, I think the interesting point that you would want to see brought up is, what about the more authoritarian ones, like, say, Calvin's Geneva, or To some extent, it is an antecedent, but I would argue that a better antecedent would be United Provinces of Holland, where they did pursue a more, uh, shall we say, perish the thought, liberal pursuit of religion, where freedom of conscience was more entrenched as a value within that state. And and to be honest, I think Calvin, Geneva, and Luther was a bit of the fact that they were recovering Catholics. I mean, if you believe in the Protestant Reformation doctrine of the perspicacity of Scripture and the idea that every individual has a right to read the Bible, and to quote Luther from Worms, unless I can be convinced by Scripture and sound reason, I can do no other, it's really difficult to develop a regime of thought policing. So to the extent it existed early on, I think it was the sense that they were still partly Catholic in their thinking. Within a century, about the 1580s, the Dutch were having free, open debates between Reformed and Mennonite theologians. So I think the logic goes to a point of tolerating different religious viewpoints without killing each other. And then lastly, markets. Obviously, ancient Athens is a classic example of a pro-market society that prospered. You could even track it back all the way to Semitic peoples like Phoenicia, Carthage, but also you could point it to the Roman Republic, the Italian city-states, Holland. Now, as far as all four in one state, again, Holland, England, and the United States, South Africa, the Commonwealth nations, they would probably be antecedents of all four being represented in one state. So that's my answer to the first question. My answer to the second question is, if I'm not mistaken, your second question was, is this really just a factor of a pre-industrial society where you have lots of cheap land and you don't need to have a lot of specialized technocratic bureaucrats to run the economy due to all the machines that are operating within it? Well, on the one hand, this is still a pre-industrial example, but you don't necessarily need to have lots of cheap land. So, for example, Athens, the late Roman Republic, Venice, Genoa, and Holland were not land-rich countries, and yet they maintain republican. I mean, in fact, Venice is the longest-lasting republic in history. Now, these were pre-industrial, and so could they be extrapolated to an information economy? I think within limits it could, because what makes the information economy unique is the fact that it is so IQ intensive. It's, highly intelligent people. It's not like, farming, you don't have to be that smart to do it, but it still needs to be done. Well, to be a merchant and a banker, you got to be a pretty smart person. That's typically why Jews dominate banking. So if even in a pre-industrial society where you had the focus of your economy being a very mentally intensive production, i.e. finance and commerce, it still more or less worked. So I think with some modification, we have a precedent for that. Now, if it turns out that we would need lots of land to be widely distributed, that doesn't exist currently now in most places. So how would it be done? I think there are a few places where it still exists. The American West, certain parts of South America, like, say, Argentina's the Pampas, and I think also probably certain parts of Australia and Canada. But yeah, highly populated areas in Asia and Europe and the Middle East, probably not so much. But if we couldn't find free land, one scenario, either by force or by essentially a hostile takeover, is you basically take over a company through share ownership and then dissolve it, and then parcel out the land to the basically recipients of New Zion's assets. Or you use some sort of state power to essentially fine corporations for violating certain laws, like charge them for fraud. So, for example, a lot of the wealth I have is due to fraud. Think of the Bernie Madoff scandal. And part of, instead of cash payouts as a penalty for fraud, they have to sell off the land they own to open it up for settlement. And so what would end up happening then is as they do fraud payouts, they become increasingly expensive because you're giving out land that you can't easily regain. And again, that's just more thinking out loud, but I think those are some of the ways I might answer your second question.
All right, so let's move into some current existing similar societies. I thought of ahead of time of three. Number one, the state of Utah. Mormons have about a 62% majority in Utah. Utah has some of the lowest crime rates, lowest rates of homelessness. California is very close to Utah. California has like 300 plus homeless people per 100,000. Utah has 91. And Salt Lake City is where a fair amount of Utah's people are. So Utah is not merely a rural state. And Utah itself was carved out, of course, by the Mormons, basically out of the desert. Utah also has very high wealth per capita as well. Salt Lake City is one of the nicest cities routinely ranked to live. And I think that's due to the fact that it's 50% Mormon. Now, you may disagree to certain aspects with Mormon theology, Mormon beliefs, but to a certain extent, from a superficial lens, Mormons already do many of the things that you would probably want New Zion to do. Another example is Israel. Israel, again, settler, founder country, basically founded in 1948, whole cloth. There was some existing population there, but many Jews from Cairo, Eastern Europe, you had people just buying up the whole German Air Force and flying it down to fight the first Arab-Israel War. And again, Israel, same thing, very, very high rate per capita, huge leader in all sorts of technology, water irrigation. If you tweak the numbers, Israel is one of the 10 richest countries in the world. If you tweak with the GDP per capita numbers per capita wise. And the third example is a state like Singapore. Singapore it's not a religious country, but Singapore has a lot of. Singapore is always a strange. Sometimes when libertarians claim Singapore, it has a lot of draconian laws, caning, can't chew gum, pornography is banned. I would imagine similar things. And Singapore was basically just cut out of a tiny little piece of around a port. And I think all three of these societies have the kind of economies, kind of social populations that you like. And would you say they are current existing similar society? Now, again, they all have slightly different beliefs and so forth. But I'll pass this back to you.
I would agree that the Mormon state of Utah, Israel, and Singapore are highly correlative to many of the ideas that I'm talking about, which could be used as circumstantial evidence of the viability of these principles in part or in whole.
In what ways would they differ from Utah, Israel, and Singapore?
I think Utah is probably the most realistic scenario in the short term. I like to say that Mormons are crypto pagans LARPing as Christians. Mormon theology talks about when you die as a Mormon male, you become a god on another planet, and then have all your spirit wives giving you children to seed that planet. There's a saying, something that goes to the effect, as God was, so are we, as God is, so we will be. It's essentially pagan, but what it has done is it's hacked into the Protestant work ethic that Weber talks about. It downloaded the app. If Utah is a phone and the Protestant work ethic is an app, they downloaded the app without Protestantism, which is interesting. Normally I wouldn't think that would be possible, but apparently Utah did it. The main difference between that would be a more self-aware, more stated up front Protestant Christian cultural ethos at a minimum. Though ideally, we'd want practicing believers as well. But again, I mean, we also respect conscience, so we can't assume that's always going to be the case. So, at a minimum, a sort of cultural Protestant, Anglo-Protestant Christianity would be the norm. And obviously, Israel is another religion, another people. Also, we wouldn't have kosher laws, obviously, because we're not Jewish. And things like that. Singapore is, was it Chinese, Malay, and the native Singapore population. So there's like different religions. It's a little too multi-ethnic for what I envision, and therefore it's a little more authoritarian because it kind of has to be in that case. Israel and Utah are homogeneous, so they're able to delegate more liberty to the population without fear of it being misused. So the main difference is probably going to be aesthetic, in the sense that what I would like to see would be different aesthetically than the Mormons, different theology, different original first principles, though the outcome might look very similar. I think also the fact that Israel and the Mormons, because they are either secular, because the modern state of Israel was founded by secular people, even though there is an ever increasing, even the religious Jewish takeover is inevitable based on demographics. The main difference would be, unlike Utah and Israel, there would be strong laws in pro-natal laws, which you don't really see in Israel. And the other problem with Israel is they tend to be a bit too degenerate with, like, gay pride and all that stuff. So beyond so be first principle differences, some aesthetic outward working differences, and more overtly against certain degenerate behaviors than either Israel or Utah is.
All right. Well, next set of questions: is it biblical? Does going out and starting a intentional community in this regard biblical? You are oftentimes, I wouldn't call you an anarchist Christian, but you oftentimes lean towards, to a certain extent, away from the more statist variety, especially the Catholic variety, which is a very statist version of Christianity. And going out and starting a state, or I mean, that's one version of doing this. You could also do some version of, like, the Free State Project, which is in New Hampshire. You could take a state that already has an existing population, just have a bunch of Christians move there. You get a majority and so forth. That's something we've talked about. You have talked about. So is this biblical? Because you do have the idea that you are in the New Testament, and this is one of the features or bugs of Christianity, that you're supposed to go out and spread the word, so to speak. You're supposed to be salt and light. Is all the Christians, coalescing around one flag somewhere in one state or one part of the world a very biblical thing to do?
Well, okay, there's a quite a few things to unpack here. So let's deal with each in turn. So the first thing is the idea of New Zion isn't, I mean, obviously it could be conceived as a nation state, but as we mentioned with the Utah option, or we call it the Mormon option, it could, or even the Amish option, it could be an intentional community within an already existing state, where we have some sort of negotiated settlement with the powers that be. So it could be, it's more basic than either of that. But let's look at it in the first case of an intentional community, where you sort of move out and then settle somewhere else. I mean, obviously the biblical analogy would be Canaan, right? Abraham was called out of Ur to go to Canaan to start over again. But I think the real question you're getting at here is, well, how do we witness the whole world if we're just all going to have all these limitations in this one place and move there? Well, I guess what I would say is New Zion is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So to give the TLDR version of my discussion on race, if your own people are going to cede, then ipso facto, you're in no position to help anyone else. So when the Gospel of John says, the book of 1 John says, if you don't love your brother whom you've seen, how can you love God whom you've not seen? Well, if you don't love your own kinsmen, which Paul thinks is very important, Romans 9:3, um, even Jesus thinks it's important when he talks to the Canaanite woman, um, you can't really help anybody else. So at the minimum, it's a means to an end. We look out for ourselves first, and then once we get our own house in order, which is exactly, to jump off the 1990s fad WWJD. Well, WWJD is start with your own tribe first, get that fixed, and then worry about everyone else. That's literally what Jesus tells the Canaanite woman. I'm going to start with the Jews first, my tribe, and then we'll sort everything else out later. So in part, I feel the need to articulate this because the West is collapsing, and we would be no good to anyone else if we're totally, collapsed and going into a new dark age. And then second of all, if you envision an export version of New Zion, I mean, theoretically, any other ethnic or tribal group could copy that, and there would be some sort of, I don't know, evangelical league, if you will, based on common doctrines and practices, possibly. But that I haven't thought that far ahead. The short answer is New Zion is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. You can't help anybody else if your own people are going to pieces. So that would be my answer to that.
How big would New Zion be? I mean, how big New Zion would be? Would it be a very large community, ideally, or would it be a very small group of conscientious, intentional people? Would it be because we already do have certain communities like this already existing in the United States. We have a large population of Amish in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Also, there's part that already exist in Canada. They exist in South America in significant numbers as well. So, to a certain extent, it already exists. Some of the things you already say exist. So, why is there a need for this, and how big would it be?
Right. So, yes, there are already existing intentional communities. I think one way to put it is a lot of this is done helter-skelter without any sort of organizing principle. So, for example, a lot of these intentional communities might be like-minded on a great variety of issues, but operate in a complete vacuum, which is ultimately not helpful. And I think part of that is because they come from different points of view. They don't really network very well, and things like that. The other question is, how large would New Zion be? Well, I mean, okay, it depends on how strict you want to make it. If we hold it to, the strictest possible standards, you might be lucky to get a few million at most. But if we take a sort of laxer view, where we sort of, I think the United States up until 1913, with a population of 160 million people, roughly approximates, say, a watered down New Zion, which is still not a bad place to live. But it is watered down to a certain degree. Though you might argue the core principles, and this is actually the key difference. While maybe everybody didn't live life as if all of this was true, the core legal principles assumed they were true. And as long as those core legal principles were in place, and as well as cultural principles, then it worked. Right? If those key institutions believed in those principles and enforced it, then everybody else just fell into line. And it looks like 150 million was the cap. Because after that, beginning in the 20th century, the United States started to radically begin to liberalize on matters of race, sex, religion, all sorts of things. So, yeah, and by watered down, I merely mean that the only people that really, the most of the people that actually believe this and enforce it are the enforcers, both either politically or culturally. And other people just go along because they're NPCs, and, well, the minister or the teacher, the civil magistrate told me that, and that's what I'm going to do. So, say 150 is the cap, from what I can tell. But again, that's not everybody's actively, born again, to use the evangelical turn of phrase. If we limit it to born again, maybe 5 million at most.
So I'm going to circle back to the biblical question, and I'm going to sort of attack this from two ends here. I'm first going to attack this on the grounds that we've had this discussion privately and to a certain extent publicly regarding Christianity's relationship with, in particular, Protestant Christianity's relationship with ideas like Jacobitism and Marxism. There is the idea that the American Revolution has Jacobin tendencies in it that's very similar to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is clearly a secular event. And we've discussed how people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they may have had Christian tendencies. Yes, Jefferson wanted to make the seal of Moses as the seal of the United States, Moses parting the Red Sea. But he also wrote the Adam and Eve letter saying that France should be reduced to two people to get the ideals of the French Revolution. And you can push this back further to a certain extent. Some of these Protestant revolutions occasionally get attacked as, and actually the Marxists themselves occasionally put as their own antecedents certain aspects of these Protestant societies that chew on. So that's my first question. I'm going to attack it, New Zion, from the left, which this may be sort of like a right-wing conservative Catholic critique of Protestantism. But is this idea in itself, many of these communities seem to be built on other ideas like democracy or equality and so forth. So I'll pass this back to you. You can answer it however you want.
You're right. The classic reactionary Rothbardian Catholic critique. Well, I would say the main problem that I have with that critique is that it would be equally valid of the republics and democracies of Greece and Rome, but is never made against them. That just begs the question, why? I mean, you can read Plato's Republic. He talks about what a democracy is like. Everybody thinks they're equal. Everybody's all uppity. It's all there. And he's referring to Athens. But of course, Athens is the only place Plato could have written the Republic in. So it's kind of weird that he has that attitude to it. And maybe you could even argue this is kind of a derivative of Plato's critique of these kinds of governments. My defense would be simply this. If you read Aristotle's The Nicomachean Ethics, in the final chapters of the book, or the final book rather, because they're organized into books, not chapters, he says that the key question of virtue is, how do you maintain virtue? He argued that virtue is maintained in the good state. And then he says that will be picked up in another book, and that's the Politics. So Aristotle's The Politics is essentially an addendum to the Nicomachean Ethics. And he says that the best form of government, the best actual form of government, is a republic, a mixed constitution, part oligarchy, part democracy. So there's nobody more trad than Aristotle. And Aristotle said that the best way to achieve a virtuous society is a mixture of democracy and oligarchy. So I'm going to rest my case with Aristotle.
Now I'm going to attack New Zion from the right. So why not theonomy? We have Gary North and his Christian Reconstruction movement. We have, of course, Calvin in Geneva. Why not theonomy? Why not have all these sort of Old Testament laws, and so to speak, and the more harsher punishments toward things like lending and fraud and all stoning and so forth?
Well, again, I know this kind of objection is kind of stale, but a lot of people will use this in regards to a certain position they don't completely disagree with. I would argue they're not consistent theonomists. So, for example, Keith Preston has argued, I think rather correctly, that Gary North is a charlatan who's trying to argue that Moses taught libertarian market theory, which clearly Moses did not. And the kind of society that Moses envisioned was not a radical Ancapistan. I think where I would argue I'm more of a theonomist than the theonomist is I take a lot of Old Testament injunctions a lot more seriously than they do. They apparently consider Sabbath and Jubilee relatively inconsequential. Even if we argue that we no longer live in an agrarian society, so, what does it mean to give the land all this rest? I mean, fair enough. But the principle behind it is, people who are disadvantaged due to ill fortune shouldn't be indiscriminately taken advantage of. And part of that is resolved by some sort of civil or judicial mechanism, which they're largely silent on. Another aspect in which theonomists are not good theonomists is stewardship. So, for example, in the Bible, when it comes to environmental concerns, which again, the Bible is not explicitly dealing with environmental concerns, but all Christians would agree that the law of Moses was a reflection of of the first major step in God's attempt to restore mankind to himself. And even though Paul says we look through a glass darkly, and Moses was only a precursor to what we have now in Christ, Moses was pointing to a vision of reality in man's relationship to himself and to creation that God thought was ideal. With that in mind, we see that some sort of concern for the lower life forms like animals and the environment is a concern even of the Torah. So, for example, if one gathers eggs to eat, you can't also kill the mother because that would, well, we know what that would do now, would lead to a collapse of the bird population, which, since there's a lot of, unclean insects that, were pests, a lot of insects were pests that birds controlled. Well, we see how useful that is now. Also, the duration of the captivity in Babylon was determined by Israel's refusal to keep Sabbath laws. So they had 70 years of captivity, which meant they missed 70 Sabbaths, which is 490 years. So we look at that. And also Revelation says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. I think it's in Hosea we read that the sin of man is manifested in the death of animal life and the impoverishment of a nation, that it runs out of food, runs out of water, animal life is destroyed. These kinds of concerns aren't front and center. In short, TLDR, modern day theonomy, is pretty much a kind of Christian veneer on anarcho-capitalism, which, okay, fine, but that's not what Moses was going to do, not by a long shot. So, and I would say, as far as the harsher penalties of the Old Testament, well, I mean, in the sense that I think an interesting point was made in Thomas More's Utopia. The traveler who tells the story about Utopia says that you English have so many capital crimes for such petty offenses. Is this really consistent with the Christian spirit of forgiveness? And I think there's a point to that. I mean, even the patriarch of the English monarchy, Alfred the Great, when he organized the laws of England, he said that, taking a human life should not be done willy-nilly or overly zealously. Even a medieval Catholic rough and tumble king is like, whoa, you even read, he's reading Moses and he says this. So I think a kind of amelioration of the harshness can be deduced from that.
So lastly, who would make up New Zion, and who would be invited? Now, you don't need to go through a line-by-line version of your, so to speak, refugee or immigration or whatever policy. And in some cases, you wouldn't have any control of this, because if you do something like the Free State Project just for Christians, lots of people can move to any state, and that's internal United States. But if you do something different and you have more control, or the founding members have more control, what would be the types of people that you'd want to invite? And this sort of relates back to the size. We've talked about this. You have something like 2 to 3 different types of people you think you would attract, or to be categories. And I mean, if you want to list names of people that you'd be interested in inviting and would have a central role, just as an example to sort of put meat on the bones of the types of people that would be allowed in this community.
Well, as far as ethnic backgrounds, Anglo-Saxons, Scots, Ulster Irishmen, South Africans, Dominion candidates like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavians, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Germany. That would be the ethnic component that we would want to have. Now, think of it more in terms of a supermajority. So, and I'll get into this a little bit later. Certain other groups, like for example, Richard Wurmbrand was a Jewish Protestant who was tortured for Christ in Romania, and in fact, "Tortured for Christ" was the name of his memoir. Um, yeah, Wurmbrand's fine. He'd be able to make it in, even though he's Jewish, but he's Protestant. That's the key difference. Even someone like, say, I mean, if Paul Gottfried were on the run and he needed somewhere to stay, because no other, there was I don't know, he was going to be killed by the ethnots because he was a Jew. He was going to be killed by the communists because he was a reactionary. Okay, fine. We give sanctuary to Paul Gottfried too, but the religious background, only Protestants would be allowed to immigrate. That's it. No one else. Now, granted, you might have internal defection. They would be dealt with differently. But if we had any sort of immigration controls, only Protestants. So the second question would be, well, let's say you had South Korea gets invaded by North Korea, and all of these, something like 20% of the population of South Korea is Protestant, and you have a boat people movement. Well, those guys would be allowed in, no problem. I mean, they're high IQ East Asians, they're Protestant, they're not going to fundamentally disrupt what we are trying to achieve in a New Zion scenario. And obviously, it's not a white ethno-state in the sense that I would not encourage Irish, Spanish, Italian, Hungarians, Polish, or any of those people to come for a whole host of reasons. So let's just say that it's not quite as simple as all whites or all free market or all this or that. And maybe it's all Protestant, I guess, but that might be the simplest. But yeah, supermajority white, Northwest European. Some exemptions made for white Protestant Jews and East Asians, and even to a limited extent Protestant Latinos. Let's say that evangelicals in Mexico are persecuted either by a revived atheist regime like the Cristero War in the 1920s, or sort of, revived Catholic theocracy, far less likely. Sure, why not? I mean, I don't think they'd fundamentally alter the status quo, and that's more a result of charity than anything. So, yeah.
As far as founding intellectuals, so to speak, if you could draft, so to speak, a group of intellectuals that you would be interested today to do this project with, if they'd all, hypothetically, you could make them all to agree, who would be on your, the American Revolution had a whole host of different people to make this thing happen, diverse set of intellectual backgrounds. Who would be a list of some sort of intellectuals today, alive today, or alive in the past 50 years, who'd be interested in recruiting? Let's say we have some sort of collapse of the United States or collapse of Europe, and an opportunity like this. We'll discuss the actual mechanics of getting to that in a later episode, possibly. But if you could have intellectuals today or alive in the past 50 years, who would be on the list of people that you'd be interested in starting this with?
Well, this will bleed over into a later episode, so I'm not going to belabel the fine points of it. Only people as they currently are now may not be acceptable to New Zion. But, again, if you happen to change your opinions, then maybe you could. So, for example, in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew would only allow ex-communists to come back into the country if they basically publicly renounced communism and divulged all the knowledge they knew. A kind of renunciation of your old beliefs that were erroneous of that level would be sufficient for you to then gain entry in New Zion. So I would definitely want someone like a William Lane Craig to organize our universities, to get us set up with philosophy and metaphysics and all that stuff. That would be for sure. As far as Bible scholarship, obviously someone like an N.T. Wright, Gary Habermas, have then set up the sort of historic New Testament theology departments. Now, obviously, when it comes to Old Testament, the more biblical fundamentalist flavor that I have, there's people from, say, the Institute for Creation Research. There's other groups like that who I would want to, I can't name names at the moment, who would want to bring to setting that up. As far as other aspects of society and developing an economy, I'd obviously want to find the leading Anabaptist leaders and get them to come in, because if you want to grow food and, nobody better than the Amish and the Hutterites, if you want to produce manufactured goods. Well, also for farming, Afrikaners are quite good. So find Afrikaner leaders. Manufacturing, I don't know of anybody who would be the best example for that. But as far as, also what else people contribute, probably someone like, well, probably some of the Christian libertarians from like LCR. Some of them, seem like they have good insights in other aspects of society. And yeah, I haven't given that as much thought as maybe you would have liked. Sorry.
Would there any people who wouldn't be invited? Who would, some people would think they'd be invited that you would not want to be there, who you think don't deserve to be there? And what would be the policy for disagreements in the society of people that I don't want to necessarily name names necessarily. If you want to name names, you go ahead. But when there's disagreements over, is this person a Catholic or is this person such and such, how would these disputes get resolved?
Well, okay, as far as, again, assuming something rough with the semblance of border control, so basically only Protestants would get invited. First come, the priority would be to Northwest European Protestants and their diaspora peoples. And then as the need arose, Jewish Protestants, East Asian Protestants, should they desire or should they need to come. I think need might be more important than just desire, because South Korea would be toast if North Korea invaded. So yeah. Now, the question I think you're getting at is an internal dispute. Let's say we have screened all these people. Let's say some people were dishonest and got in under false pretenses. Let's say that some people, there's just the retention rate. Not every religion/ideology has 100% retention rate. Well, if it can be proven that you came in under false pretenses like any other, we'd deport you, like anybody else would do that in the same conditions. But let's say that you were homegrown and you had a change of conscience and believed something else. Or let's say you were a migrant that came in under good faith but then changed your mind. You don't forfeit your rights. You wouldn't be allowed to be a citizen. You'd be a second-class citizen in the country, but you could still, live your life and find some form of employment and own the property you've already acquired. But that would be it. You would be kind of isolated in that regard, and you might even be encouraged to leave where you'd find companionship more to your liking. That's probably how I would deal with those two kinds of disagreement.
And this would probably be my last two questions. Do you want this? And first question is, do you want this to happen? And then we'll sort of get into the mechanics of how this might happen in a later episode. But the first question is, do you want this to happen? Because it seems like the way through this is either the most likely way you get this society is through some sort of genocide or some sort of, which could very easily happen, or some sort of global cataclysm or something like that, or some sort of collapse of the United States or collapse of NATO, some big war. So to a certain extent, the opportunity for this to happen is probably going to not be some sort of roses and rainbow scenarios where we just get a huge, ever-increasing wealth and it just creates a new Zion Disneyland, so to speak. That scenario may happen, but that scenario, who knows? If you look at history, history is full of dead civilizations. So it seems like eventually this will happen to the United States. And the second question is, why do you want this to happen? Forgetting what the way you get through to your destination, but why do you want this to happen? Why do you want all the Christians to congregate in one area? Or not all the Christians, but a significant number and a significant type. Is this a kind of hedonism? Is this a kind of utopian community? Is this for your own personal enjoyment? I'm saying this in very ambivalent terms. I'm not against hedonism or anything. But why do you want this to happen, regardless of how we get there? And if we have to get there is through this sort of genocide, because states like Israel was only formed. And again, I don't really want to get into the specifics here, but I doubt Israel could have been formed without a certain set of historical circumstances. I don't think Singapore could have been, or Hong Kong would have been formed without some sort of civil war. Same way with Taiwan. Taiwan was formed after a civil war. And Mormons were persecuted in New York. They persecuted in Missouri. So they only created Utah after a long line of persecutions. So in both scenarios of my current existing societies, they got there in sort of negative fashion.
Well, in the case of North America, I think it's, especially further west you go, it's probably safe to say the genocide already happened. The combination of westward expansion and diseases decimated the original inhabitants of North America. Now, the Mormon Utah state, which I think you and I agree is probably the closest living example to New Zion, is actually interesting in that its formation is not primarily marked by the kind of bloodletting that you usually associate, like, say, as you said, Israel or Taiwan or other places like that. Again, not to be glib. I mean, it depends on a whole wide range of factors. But I think, again, without bleeding too much into the next episode, the most likely outcome would be within the current system as it already exists, Christians come together, buy up a lot of land. And because, the United States respects property rights, removing people from land you already own doesn't have to be excessively violent. The real violence might occur once the system collapses, in which case that would be an objection that would apply to anybody that seeks to create an alternative. What makes New Zion different than most of these other alternatives is it can theoretically coexist within the status quo. Ideally, would you like to live without the status quo lording it over you? Yeah, that would be ideal. But like the Mormons in Utah, we're not necessarily predicated on that, which does, I think, put a damper on any sort of apocalyptic bloodbath. But then if the system does collapse, well, then it's going to be a bloodbath everywhere for everybody. And the question then is why? Well, the why, let's begin. One, I believe this is the best way to restore and save the European project. Because I would argue that Northwest Europeans with the Dutch, the English, and Americans, what we might call the Western branch of that, and the Eastern branch, which is dominated by Germany, and to a lesser extent Sweden, are the pinnacles of Western civilization. Everything that the defenders of the West want to defend is reaching its pinnacle in this culture. And as such, it has been the most resilient against the threats to the West, whether it be Islam, Jacobin revolutionaries like Napoleon or Robespierre, or Marxist subversion or conquest. It's been the most resilient. Now, it hasn't been effective everywhere and always. No system is. But it's proven to be the most resilient to these threats to the Western experiment. Second of all, from my more parochial theological positions, Anglo-Saxon societies have been the most tolerant of these sort of independent, world-denying denominations. All of Europe was a bloodbath. I mean, Quakers, Mennonites, Baptists, they were run all over the place, including England. And, eventually England improved and Holland improved. And then ultimately the United States was founded on such principles to begin with. It's the only system outside of these very narrow independent church communities that really is amenable to us even existing without trying to stamp us out like Muslims, Catholics, and atheists. And then I guess thirdly, I also see this as the best way to preserve Anglo-Saxon peoples.
Great. Well, that ends my questions for today. Thanks for doing this. I think you answered both the left-wing critique of New Zion and the right-wing critique of New Zion, and you sort of laid out a sketch of what New Zion will be.
All right. Thanks again, Tim. This is Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Five podcast, signing off.